You know exactly how the story ends. The fall of Berlin, the destruction of the Third Reich, the end of the deadliest conflict in human history. But we rarely look at the psychological collapse that happened right before the end. What actually happened in the dark? What drove the most dangerous man in history to the absolute breaking point? Did he go mad? Did he finally realize it was all over? Or was he completely delusional until the very last second? These are the final days of Hitler. By the spring of 1945, the thousand-year Reich was in its death throes. Above ground, the historic and once pristine capital of Berlin was being systematically reduced to a landscape of shattered glass, twisted metal, and burning rubble. The Soviet Red Army, armed with thousands of tanks and millions of vengeful soldiers, was steadily tightening a perimeter around the city center. The sky was permanently stained black with ash and smoke. But 28 feet below this apocalyptic nightmare, a completely different reality existed. This was the Führerbunker, enclosed in a shell of solid reinforced concrete, with a roof extending almost 10 feet thick. The bunker was a subterranean maze of roughly 30 cramped, suffocating rooms. It was never meant to serve as a permanent headquarters, but by mid-April, it had become the final operational center of the Nazi Empire. Life inside this concrete tomb was a psychological torment. There was no sunlight. There was no fresh air, only the damp, stale stench of sweat, unwashed uniforms, cheap disinfectant, and the exhaust fumes from the massive diesel generator that kept the lights from going out. The heavy steel bulkhead doors were sealed tight, trapping the humidity inside. The walls constantly trembled, weeping condensation as heavy Soviet artillery shells rained down on the chancellery above. Day and night ceased to exist. Time was measured only by the endless, exhausting military briefings and the steady shrinking of the lines on the map. Down here, isolated from the carnage of the streets, the high command of a dying empire paced the narrow corridors. And at the center of it all was a man whose physical and mental state was rapidly deteriorating. To look at Adolf Hitler in April 1945 was to look at a man hollowed out by his own disastrous war. He was only 56 years old, but witnesses described him as looking closer to 70. He walked with a heavy, shuffling stoop. His left arm and leg trembled violently, a symptom of advancing Parkinson's disease that he tried desperately to hide by clutching his left hand behind his back. His eyes, once described as piercing and hypnotic, were now bloodshot, glassy, and sunken deep into his skull. Much of this physical decay was fueled by a staggering daily cocktail of drugs. For years, his personal physician, Theodor Morell, had been injecting him with a bizarre mixture of vitamins, animal hormones, opiates, and methamphetamines. But as the war effort collapsed, not even the drugs could mask the grim reality of the situation. Yet, for weeks, Hitler completely refused to accept that reality. Deep inside the map room of the bunker, he bent over spread-out topographical charts of Berlin, magnifying glass in hand. Surrounded by his exhausted, terrified generals, he issued grand, sweeping orders. He commanded entire army groups to launch massive pincer movements to encircle the Soviets. The generals stood in the damp silence, exchanging panicked glances. They knew the truth, but they were absolutely terrified to speak it. The armies Hitler was commanding no longer existed. The divisions he was moving across the map were nothing more than phantom units, decimated weeks ago, lacking tanks, lacking ammunition, and lacking men. While Hitler imagined glorious counterattacks, the actual defense of Berlin had been left to exhausted old men of the local militia and radicalized children of the Hitler Youth, some as young as 12, firing anti-tank weapons at Soviet armor from the ruins of their own homes. The dictator was completely insulated by his own delusion, living in a fantasy world crafted by his own ego. But that illusion was about to be violently shattered. The breaking point arrived on the afternoon of April 22nd. During the daily situation conference, Hitler demanded an update on a massive counteroffensive he had ordered the previous day, to be led by SS General Felix Steiner. He had staked the entire survival of Berlin on this attack. The room fell dead silent. The commanding officers looked at the floor. Finally, one of the generals found the courage to speak. The attack had never taken place. Steiner's forces were too weak, too disorganized, and entirely incapable of mounting an offensive. The troops simply weren't there. What followed was the most explosive, terrifying psychological breakdown of the entire war. Witnesses later described the dictator's face turning a deep, violently pale shade of purple. He ordered everyone out of the room except for his top generals, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, Hans Krebs, and Wilhelm Burgdorf. For hours, the screams echoed through the concrete corridors of the bunker. Hitler flew into a blind, hysterical rage. He accused his generals of unprecedented cowardice. He screamed that he had been betrayed by the army, sabotaged by his commanders, and surrounded by liars and traitors since the very beginning. He shouted that the German people had proven themselves weak and unworthy of his grand vision. And then, the screaming suddenly stopped. Hitler collapsed backward into his heavy wooden chair. The trembling in his hands worsened. He stared blankly at the map on the table. For the very first time in the entire 12-year history of the Third Reich, he openly admitted the truth. The war was lost. In a quiet, defeated voice, he announced that the Third Reich had failed. He explicitly stated that he would not flee to the safety of the mountains in the south. He would remain exactly where he was, in Berlin, to command the final defense. And when the end came, he would shoot himself rather than be captured and paraded through the streets of Moscow like an animal. Once the dictator admitted defeat, the absolute fanatical loyalty he had demanded for over a decade began to evaporate. The rats were abandoning the sinking ship, and the psychological toll this took on Hitler was immense. The first massive blow came on April 23rd. A telegram arrived from Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's officially designated successor. Sitting safely in the Bavarian Alps, Göring requested permission to take total control of the German government, stating that since Hitler was trapped in Berlin, he was no longer fit to lead. Hitler's depression instantly morphed back into a paranoid fury. He viewed the telegram as the ultimate act of high treason. He stripped Göring of all his titles, expelled him from the Nazi Party, and ordered his immediate arrest. But the most devastating betrayal was yet to come. On April 28th, a radio operator in the bunker picked up a broadcast from the British news agency, Reuters. The broadcast revealed that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the architect of the Holocaust, and one of Hitler's most trusted, ruthless, and fanatical loyalists, had secretly been trying to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. This revelation completely shattered whatever remained of Hitler's sanity. If Himmler, the most loyal of the loyal, could betray him, then the entire world had turned against him. The paranoia in the bunker reached a fever pitch. Desperate for revenge and unable to reach Himmler, Hitler ordered the immediate execution of Hermann, Himmler's liaison in the bunker, who also happened to be the brother-in-law of Hitler's mistress, Eva Braun. Fegelein was dragged up to the Chancellery Garden and shot like a dog. Surrounded by the enemy above and betrayed by his closest allies below, the bunker descended into a state of pure, suffocating fatalism. By April 29th, the situation above ground was entirely hopeless. Soviet shock troops were fighting street by street, building by building, and had advanced to within a few hundred yards of the bunker. The heavy thud of artillery was so close that plaster dust constantly rained down from the bunker ceiling. Realizing that the end was only hours away, Hitler made a final, bizarre, personal decision. Shortly after midnight, In a small, damp map room, lit by dim bulbs, he officially married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. A low-ranking municipal official was dragged into the bunker from the war zone outside to perform the civil ceremony. In a moment of supreme, almost comical absurdity amidst the apocalypse, the official was required by Nazi law to ask both Hitler and Braun to confirm that they were of pure Aryan descent and free of any hereditary diseases, while the explosions of Soviet shells literally shook the floor beneath their feet. Immediately following the grim, quiet wedding breakfast, Hitler retreated to a side room with his youngest secretary, Traudl Junge. There, he paced the floor and dictated his final political testament. Even at the absolute end, surrounded by the ruins of his own country and responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people, he took absolutely zero responsibility. He blamed the generals. He blamed the politicians. And most vehemently, he continued to blame the Jews for starting the war. The delusion was perfectly intact until the very end. April 30th, 1945. The final day. News reached the bunker that the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini had been captured, executed, and his body hung upside down at a gas station in Milan, where crowds threw stones at his corpse. This terrified Hitler. He was determined to never let his body fall into the hands of the Soviets. To ensure his suicide would be successful, he ordered a test of the cyanide capsules supplied by the SS. The capsules were crushed inside the mouth of his beloved German shepherd, Blondie, who died instantly. At roughly 2:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun ate their final meal, a quiet lunch of spaghetti with tomato sauce. After lunch, the remaining bunker staff, secretaries, cooks, and guards were lined up in the narrow, humid hallway. Hitler, his eyes completely vacant, shuffled slowly down the line, silently shaking hands with the people who had stayed with him to the end. At 3:30 p.m., Adolf and Eva Hitler walked into his private study. The heavy steel door was pulled shut behind them. Outside in the corridor, his most loyal aides, including Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, stood in dead silence, waiting. The muffled sounds of the war raging above ground filtered through the concrete. Minutes passed, and then a single sharp gunshot echoed through the bunker. After waiting a few moments, the aides opened the study door. The smell of burnt almonds from the cyanide gas and the sharp tang of gunpowder filled the small room. Adolf Hitler was slumped over on the blood-soaked sofa, having shot himself in the right temple with his Walther pistol. Next to him, Eva Braun lay dead, having bitten down on a cyanide capsule. The man who had sought to conquer the world and build an empire that would last 1,000 years had ended his life in a subterranean concrete box, leaving his country completely annihilated. Following his strict, paranoid final orders, his aides wrapped the bodies in dark gray blankets. They carried the corpses up the steep concrete emergency stairs, pushing open the heavy gas-tight door into the absolute hellscape of the Reich Chancellery Garden. Soviet artillery shells were continuously exploding in the courtyard, forcing the SS guards to seek cover. During a brief pause in the shelling, the bodies were dropped into a shallow crater. Desperate to erase the dictator from history before the Red Army arrived, the guards poured over 50 gallons of gasoline onto the corpses. Someone struck a match and tossed it into the crater. A massive fireball erupted, consuming the bodies as the Soviet shells began to rain down again. The aides stood at attention, gave a final silent Nazi salute to the burning pyre, and retreated back into the darkness of the bunker. 2 days later, the garrison of Berlin officially surrendered to the Soviet Union. The Third Reich, the brutal regime that had promised a millennium of glory, had survived for barely 12 years. It ended not in triumph, but in rubble, madness, and ash.